All right, hello there, History 131 kids, and this is a little quick lecture about colonial America and how the different colonies developed differently. It's a little bit, and we're going to talk about things like New England colonies or Northern colonies and Southern colonies, and they're not exactly the same way that we think of those areas of the country today. So it's a pretty neat little thing. All right, before we start talking about that, let's start talking about the mercantilist system here. The mercantilist system is what's going to really set us on the road to revolution in so many ways. And under a mercantilist system, colonies, they exist as a market for the home country's goods. In our case, it's going to be England or Great Britain or whatever you want to call them. And those colonies are also going to exist as a supplier of raw materials. So colonies become in essence, a little captive market and a captive source of raw materials. Okay, so they're existing for the benefit of that mother country, and all of the trade with other countries has got to go through that home country. It's kind of like if you fly enough, you're going to go through Atlanta at some point. And I've always said if you died and you go to the devil, they send you through Atlanta. But you have to go through Atlanta, and so everything's going that way. So they have to go through them, and they pass a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts in the middle of the 17th century that kind of force that to happen. And so, colonies are your raw material source, they're a captive market, and now you're going to make sure that every piece of shipping that they do comes through you, in and out, out and in. Okay. So how does that work? It means that all of that trade has to be on these English or colonial ships, and which are going to be English ships. Okay, so you're not using French or Spanish or whatever. So you're using your own boats, so to speak. And there's a list of products that I've got here. I've called enumerated products. That's tobacco and sugar, indigo, cotton, and there's others. Those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head that could be shipped only to England or other English colonies. You can't, no matter what. You're not selling it to a different country. So you can sell it to English colonies, you can sell it to England, you can't sell it to France, you can't sell it to Spain, Portugal, some of the nations of Italy, what is now, Germany can't do it. And then there's only certain English made goods like gunpowder and silk, very, very, very important at the time. They're subsidized to undercut competitors. So what I mean by that, if you want to kind of basically curtail foreign goods coming in, you throw a tariff on them. We hear a lot about that here lately with our government. But this one, they're going to subsidize. It means they're going to actually pay for parts of it. They're going to lower that price so that you don't want to buy goods from other countries. So if you're England, this is a great system. If you're the colonies, it depends. Okay. And it depends because as long as prices are low, everything's good for stuff that you buy. When prices are high, it stinks. When prices are low for things that you're selling, that stinks as well. So it's a very double-edged sword, and again, it can be quite shady depending on your point of view. Now, in terms of the American colonies, and as I said here, in general, they prosper. That's true. There's no way around it. They actually do. They prosper. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, big giant ports in America. Notice there's one I don't have here, Charleston. Charleston, South Carolina is one of the biggest ports in America, and Savannah was growing by that point because, hey, you got to take those goods somewhere. Okay, even the good old Broad River that's relatively near us, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, you end up in Charleston Harbor. So it's going to be, those things are going to be great because all the stuff that's coming out of America and all the stuff that's coming to America. But tobacco and rice planters are going to complain a little bit simply because of the way the shipping price structure works. They don't think they're getting enough money for it. They think it costs too much to ship because their goods are relatively heavy and bulky. And again, that's why you're going to see Charleston and Savannah rise in importance in American history. Now, as this rolls along, you get some of the American political and economic class that are going to decide that mercantilist laws are excessive. So they ignore them. Okay, it's not like today where you can track somebody with a cell phone. Back then, you could simply ignore it, and as long as nobody was around to see it, you got away with it, kind of like me driving down the road speeding. So James II, the King of England, he decides, you know what, I've had enough of this. You people are messing up what I'm doing. You're messing up my good little, money making scheme I've got going. So he revokes New England's charter. And we're not going to get too deep into that because it's a whole bunch of mess and it reads like some 21st century politics. But he established something called the Dominion of New England and took away all these land grants and outlawed town meetings and basically took their right, what they saw as their right to self government away. There's your problem. Not only are you taking money out of their pockets and costing them more money to buy things, but now he's removed your basically your ability to govern yourselves that they have had for, at that point in time, well over 100 years. This is going to create itself a little bit of 100 years. No, not quite 100 years, but since the beginning of permanent colonies in America. So he's playing with fire. And so, as you can see, you look at something called the triangle trade, okay? And that triangular trade route is in almost every high school textbook, in American history class going. You've probably seen it in high school. But this triangular trade is a result of this mercantilist pattern, okay? And if you look at this thing real close, if you hit the pause button and you look at it, look what's going where. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton goes to Europe. Cotton, I really wish they wouldn't say that because cotton is way too expensive at that time. But sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, yes. Then see what goes down to Africa here. You see the second leg of that triangle. Textiles, rum, manufactured goods, lots of things, okay? So they get to, and then what comes over to the Americas, okay, that's going to be in what we know as America, or it can be Latin and Central America or the Caribbean, and that's going to be slaves. And so this little triangle keeps itself going and props itself up. So it is a huge money-making endeavor for somebody. But in 1688, what happens is Great Britain has that glorious revolution. And what you what you see here is basically King James is going to returning on to Catholicism. That's what they think, blah, blah, blah. We're not really worried about that over here on our side of the pond. All right? So what happens is Mary and her husband William, the Duke of Orange, they get enthroned. Anyway, what this boils down to is the king is still the titular head of the government, but the parliament itself is the one who's going to really be in charge. They control the money. They have done that for years, but now they're going to have they're going to be a little bit more powerful than the king, and you're going to see this bit of them vying back and forth until we kick them out in 1783. But if you go back to the Enlightenment, John Locke's two treatises on government, that's going to come 30, 40, 50 years after this time, he says that power flows from the consent of the governed, not from God, but that divine right of kings. And he says that citizens have inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property, that Jefferson's going to plagiarize real bad in the Declaration and call it life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But you get this idea that power in the government comes from the bottom up, from the people up, not from the top down, not from some divine right, not from God saying, hey, king or queen, you get to rule, but the power comes from the people themselves, okay? That is where the consent of the governed comes from. We've got to keep this in our head because that's coming in the next couple of weeks. Then, during this time of the Glorious Revolution and the Dominion of New England and this other stuff, you have revolts in Massachusetts, you have them down in Maryland, you have them in New York, all of this that says basically these colonies over here have the right to voluntarily side with the crown. And we have the right to self-government. Now, the crown is going to say, what is your problem? What have you been smoking over there? But these are going to be arguments we're going to see later that we all know come from in the American Revolution, but they're coming, you look at this 90 years earlier. But so for the next little while, England's going to enter a period of what sometimes are called benign neglect or salutary neglect or whatever it is, but it's basically let the colonies do their own thing. They allow them to grow in wealth and population and self-government without a ton of regulation. And this comes for till about the 1750s, when there is a distinct conflict with the French over the control of North America. So for the longest time here, we're going to have this period, this salutary neglect, and in the American mind, it's this idea that, hey, we do have that right to self-government. We do have the right to inalienable rights. If we really want rid of the king, we can, though nobody, or the parliament, nobody wants to at this stage, or nobody, and I say that, I'm talking about there is no sizable portion of the population that wants to do it. They see themselves as Englishmen. So what happens is the colonies going to basically be divided into four separate regions. And if you went back into your high school U.S. history text, it's probably going to say three, which is the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the New England colonies. What most textbooks don't talk about is the frontier, and that's going to become so important over the next 80 years of the history of the United States from where we are now. Plantation South is Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. Okay, those are considered southern colonies. The middle ones are Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York. I think of those as the North. I don't know about y'all, okay? But we're not then. But the northern or New England colonies, you can see here at top, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. I've got actually Connecticut right there. I can't read. New Hampshire, all of those are going to be in Maine, which is up there, but not really a whole lot just yet. Those are your New England colonies. But west of the Appalachian Mountains, I mean, quite literally, if it's a clear day and you're in Gaston County, you can see them. You can see the frontier from where you are. That is going to be anything west of what we now might call the Continental Divide, or maybe even a little east. Okay, so that becomes important. So those regions have very different needs. They have very different characteristics, and they grow very differently over this vast and quickly evolving period of time. So we're going down here to the Plantation South for just a second, because that may be what we're most familiar with, simply because we live in the South. But it's not back here where we are. We're in the back country where we're at right here, or the backwater area, if we're going to listen to Patrick Ferguson during his ill-fated Kings Mountain campaign. What we're really looking at in the Plantation South is the Tidewater region, the areas that drain directly into the Atlantic in some way, shape, or form, that are, east or just barely west of the what's the line called there? Continental Divide is not what I'm thinking of, but it's where the land drops off, becomes flat. And you know what, I'm going to remember it in a few minutes, and y'all going to laugh at me later. But they have the coastal plains. It's a very sandy, very alluvial soils, great for growing certain things. The rivers are wide, which means they're navigable. The fall line, Lord have mercy. There we go. Told you I was going to remember it. Very rich soil from the runoffs that are coming, from upstream, and it's very suited to tobacco farming because it's acidic. Now, tobacco farming is one of those things that leaches minerals out of the soil. They don't know that just yet, because the land is so vast in America that they don't know it. But what happens is, if you're going to grow something like tobacco, you've got to grow a ton of it to make any money. And so these large plantations grow up. There's a huge farm. A plantation is not like what you think of in Gone with the Wind, especially not at this point. But a plantation at this time was something that was a very large farm. It may be 1,000 acres, maybe more than that. And as that soil gets exhausted, you've got to have more and more lands. So what happens? Plantations become a self-sufficient economic unit. They grew what they ate. They made what they needed. It was like its own little, very minute city-state from like back in the ancient Greeks. But labor becomes so important, because there is no, it takes so much to farm this stuff. And Native Americans or Amerindians were not well suited to being slave type workers. They were very vulnerable to diseases of the Europeans. It was just very against their way of life for thousands and thousands of years, and they tended to die very early, or they could run away if given the chance. So then indentured servitude became a thing. Hey, we're going to pay for you to come over. You agree to work for a period of time, generally 7 years, blah, blah, blah. But you had to be very wealthy to be able to have a lot of indentured servants, and they became really hard to obtain. They got to be very hard to retain. After 7 years, they do whatever they want to. It's just not a great system. So demand for African slaves increased, and you've got nearly 500,000. We hear 400,000. The numbers vary depending on who you read. By the eve of the American Revolution, you may have as many as 500,000. So that becomes the real feature, because that is the cheaper labor source for these very labor-intensive crops, and that's what happens in the Plantation South. It doesn't happen back here where we're at, because this soil is no good for those crops at that time. It's not real good even for cotton later. It only becomes good for cotton in the 20th century with the advent of phosphate fertilizers. All right. So what happens in terms of education? Well, only the children of planters were educated. Okay, they were. I mean, just regular folks like my family would have been back then, and they were here by the 1750s. They were in the greater Cleveland County area, but they would not have been. But only children of planters were educated, and higher educated was only for those that could afford it. So this is a very elite group of people. Okay, and so these people become the leading economic forces of the South, political forces of the South. They determine what the society looked like and how it was structured. They made the laws, so they're the only ones that are voting. Hence my statement here that democracy is limited to wealthy landowners. And they're a very, 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 very small minority. It is by no means common to be those people. Okay, got to get that in our heads. It is by no means common. But in the middle colonies, okay, and again, this is Pennsylvania and New York and things like that. They have three major rivers. The Hudson River, I remember old Sullenberger landed the plane in it. The Delaware River, and then the Susquehanna, and they all flow south from north to south, and they are massive trade paths because the river systems of this area are much more intricate than they are down here in the South, and much more navigable and usable. And so what you get is it's pretty easy to get into the interior. The state of North Carolina, or the colony of North Carolina, was very hard to colonize because there's no good way to the interior. We were colonized by people coming down from Virginia and by people coming up from what is now South Carolina. It's really quite odd when you think about our coastline. It doesn't allow for this, whereas the middle colonies does, and then they have those rivers that are navigable through there. The only one that North Carolina really has is the Cape Fear. And you don't think about that very often today, but it was at this time, but that was it. Okay. So in these numbers of immigrants that come in the Hudson, valley, you had the Dutch, from Holland and the Low Country area right there. Okay, pretty good. The Germans in Pennsylvania, which sometimes we confuse them because we talk about Pennsylvania Dutch, it really should be Pennsylvania Deutsch, which actually means German. And then, the Scotch Irish here, I really need to change this. Scotch is a liquor. Scots are people. So the Scots Irish in Pennsylvania, and a lot of them, including my own family on both sides, comes out of Pennsylvania down that Philadelphia wagon road, which really about dead ends almost to what is now Columbia, South Carolina. It comes through Charlotte in Pennsylvania, and they're going to move their way southward. So you have Scots Irish, you've got Germans, you've got the Low Country Dutch, a lot of immigrants wanting to get the heck out of Europe at this time, because America was, as today, was then seen as that land of opportunity. But how about New England? Okay, up in the tip top where it stays cold all the time, or at least in my mind it does. I know that's not right, but in my mind, anyway, 95% of them are English immigrants, mostly from these little villages throughout the greater England, and they come in groups and they settle in towns, and all their families have known each other for 800 million years, which is about the way the South is today. But they come in groups and they settle in these little towns, and they have town meetings. That's their form of democracy. It's the original form of democracy in America, and so they're voting on things. Then they create little republics. It talks about here the select men. All that is a representative, someone to represent them. Okay, so they have that going on there. Now, their occupations, they include farming. That's the biggest occupation in this entire thing, whether you're New England, middle, or southern colonies. That's the biggest thing that you do. Okay, but labor was scarce in the north, so you have big families to do that kind of stuff. The conditions are tough. I mean, the soil's rocky, but the soil itself is very rich. It's just rocky. It can be hard. It can be frozen at times. There's not a lot of extra labor floating around like for plantation or agriculture. It just doesn't exist there. There's fishing, especially up in the Massachusetts area. There's commerce, trading back and forth, and shipping. Look here, it says that shipbuilding becomes a major supplement. Absolutely. Those ships you just don't conjure them up, and they have to be built. And shipping becomes a big thing, especially in those coastal cities, trading back and forth. Slave trading. People don't like to talk about it, but it came out of the New England areas. rum, part of that triangular trade, all of this stuff brings all of this money in to New England. So these colonies are very symbiotic in a lot of ways. They need each other for so many things. And in the meantime, England is trying to make sure that all of it runs through them and they reap the profit. So you can kind of see the struggle that is going to develop, at least philosophically, at this particular stage. Why should I give it to them? Why should we listen to them? We should be able to govern ourselves. The power of government comes from the people that you get where I'm going here. But in the backcountry or the frontier, this is where a lot of your Scots Irish go to settle, up in the Appalachian Mountains in its various guises: Blue Ridge, Smoky Mountains, Alleghenies, whatever it is. This is where they go settle, and they tend to have large families. And they have been pushed westward by the exhausted soil. They have been pushed westward because the best soil had been bought and used for other things. Some of them are religious dissenters. Some of them are just immigrants trying to get the heck out of wherever, whether it's Scotland, Ireland, England, wherever. Some are criminals. The colony of Georgia was founded as a colony for political criminals and debtors and all of that. So they're going to find this refuge the farther west they went. And that's going to become a theme that we're never going to exhaust in this class, and we will not really exhaust until about a third of the way through History 132, which is if you can't handle it in the east, you always go west. If there is a pressure building up in the colonies, poof, the release valve is to the west. And up until 1890, there's always a west to go into. There's always a frontier. But the people that go out there, and Patrick Ferguson's going to find this business out in late 1780 when he threatens to lay the country waste with fire and sword. These people, they govern themselves. They are very, very staunch in their defense of that. Any governmental interference, whether it's from the eastern elites, they call them, with North Carolina with a regulator movement. Same thing happened in South Carolina. Bacon's rebellion up in Virginia, there is objection to any type of interference in their life because they govern themselves. This is a different sort of folk that you're going to find. Okay, today, many of us may be descended from them. I know I am, but it is really interesting back then how they react to anything they see as an infringement that other people might be like, that's just how it is. Not to them. Okay, so they're anti-aristocratic. They resent the urban areas. This is a group, if you want to fight a war, you want to make sure what side they are going to fall on. And the British make some grave miscalculations during the American Revolution. And so next is the growth of the colonial assembly. How do these colonies govern themselves? They can't pick up the iPhone and call the king or call the parliament or call whoever. But the colonial assemblies, they want to limit this royal authority pretty dang quick. Once they become self-sustaining in a lot of ways, they think they don't need the mother country. Now, they're going to find out real quick in the 1750s if they're not right in that. But they want to limit royal authority and make sure that the colonial assembly, controls taxes, appointing officials, even setting the governor's salary. That's how you control the governor. You give him money or take that money away. This is taxation with representation. These people in this assembly represent me because I probably can vote for them, and therefore taxation from them is legitimate because I am actually represented by them. Now, Parliament's going to argue, no. Parliament represents all members of Great Britain. They don't carry any weight with me either, and much less these people back then. But, if you read a textbook the wrong way, you start thinking, these assemblies, man, that's really great. That's a lot of democracy. No. They're very elitist because your regular folks, Arthur Patterson sitting on Kings Creek over there, is never going to be part of an assembly because he's never going to have enough money to be part of that circle. So they're very elitist, and the only people standing for office are very wealthy, though we can vote. Most property-owning men have that right to vote at that time, but get that out of your head that this is some real down and dirty democracy. Man, it's pure and blah, blah. No, it's not. There's always a layer of elite and rich and this, that, and other, as we're talking about governmental structures in this country. Okay, I mean, there's no other way for me to put it. And lastly, here, with those assemblies continue to grow, especially following the Glorious Revolution, because at that point in time, Parliament doesn't really know how they want to control the colonies. Sometimes they're out of sight, out of mind, and so these mobs start to exert this control. Okay, they even ignore the local assemblies themselves. So this mob rule here. So we've got to get that vision in our head, because democracy equals mob rule is going to be an idea that's going to permeate even the men who found this country. Not saying it's right, I'm saying that's what's in their head. Okay, so these mobs at this time that exert that control, I mean, it's kind of like in that movie Gladiator 20-something years ago, where it says, Rome is the mob. Well, it's the same thing here. The colony is the mob. And when they can exert that numbers influence like this and the threats of violence, it's a pretty powerful motivator. And what happens is you go to the second bullet, and the British policy, that salutary neglect, allows that control to grow to the point where you can't stop it. I have always used this analogy with students for nearly 30 years now. It's kind of like back in 1989, I graduated from high school and went to UNCC to college. So I was away, for weeks at a time. I could do what I want to. I could get up when I wanted to. I could go to sleep when I wanted to. I could eat what I wanted to. I could act how I wanted to. Mom and Daddy weren't around. Weren't cell phones back then. They couldn't track me. And then all of a sudden you come home for like a Christmas break and they're like, hey, you be home by winter midnight. Or why are you doing this? You can't do that. That is that salutary neglect. When somebody tries to put the crank down on it, it creates a problem. Okay. And so this local control creates this feeling there should always be local control. And when what is, quite frankly, a legitimate authority wants to put stop to it, it becomes a point of contention. And so that's where we will leave things for today.